Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. And look at my face. I've got the full light shining on me. I've no idea how to change it. It's winter and it's light, so I'm here. Okay, this is me. Welcome back to Drop In with Chanti. And we're going to be looking at part two today of just exploring from the podcast of the best kept secrets of the deep state, right? By the Free People's Movement of Sweden. And last week we definitely looked at the Wallenbergs and the Warburgs and Ericsson. Man, oh man, when we're looking at how the Rockefellers operate and the Rothschilds, we think and it's so true what they were saying. Remember that the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds are very much in plain sight. They are hidden in plain sight. So we think they are the head and the capital of the banking industry and the root of all corruption on the planet. We're looking at the Warburgs and the Wallenbergs of Sweden and Ericsson. Ericsson, who has 184 servers in their country, controlling full media output, right? And very interesting. So let's have a look. So last week we just covered, and if you missed last week's show, please catch it, because in part one we explored the origins of central banking, creation of money through debt, and the influence of powerful financial interests throughout modern history. These guys are on tap here. So give their channel a shout out, give their channel a like, a share, and a subscribe, because they've really done great work. So we're going to be looking at the next 4 episodes today of Sweden. Sweden and all their Vikings. Yay, I love the Vikings. You got to know that, right? But very interesting. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so get your chai. Ta-da. Put your feet up. It's Friday. And let's sit for the next hour and listen to some more scandalous things that are happening in the underbelly of the world. Take it easy, everybody. Enjoy.
Episode 8. Raoul Wallenberg. What really happened to him? Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish architect, businessman, diplomat, and humanitarian. Born the 4th of August 1912 and disappeared the 17th of January 1945. The official story is that he saved thousands of Jews in German-occupied Hungary during the Holocaust from German Nazis and Hungarian fascists during the later stages of World War II. While serving as Sweden's special envoy in Budapest between July and December 1944, Wallenberg issued protective passports and sheltered Jews in buildings designated as Swedish territory. While some have claimed that Wallenberg rescued as many as 100,000 Jews, some historians consider that figure to be an exaggeration, and the actual number of people rescued to be substantially lower. Is it still considered rescuing if the people who got rescued had to pay their rescuer? If you have taken anything from previous episodes, you have probably gathered that the Wallenbergs are not really in it for humanitarian reasons. On the 17th of January 1945, during the siege of Budapest by the Red Army, Wallenberg was detained by Smersh on suspicion of espionage and subsequently disappeared. He was later reported to have died on the 17th of July 1947 while imprisoned in the Lubyanka, the prison at the headquarters of the KGB secret police in Moscow. The motives behind Wallenberg's arrest and imprisonment by the Soviet government, along with questions surrounding the circumstances of his death and his ties to US intelligence, remain mysterious and are the subject of continued speculation. So, let's speculate. Documents from the Swedish Military Intelligence Agency's archive show that Swedish intelligence officers in 1943 began a secret collaboration with high-ranking colleagues within Hungarian intelligence and counterintelligence services. This regarding intelligence operations carried out by local communists and the Soviet Union. The Swedish involvement in such activities was very sensitive because since June 1941, Sweden officially represented Soviet interests in Hungary and in other Axis powers. So Sweden played on both sides, as usual. It's hard to fend off the impression that so did Raoul Wallenberg, on several levels. In addition, the Swedish delegation in Budapest, Raoul Wallenberg included, supported the Hungarian resistance movement, whose main goal was to defeat Nazism, which they themselves, of course, were behind, and at the same time, prevent a Soviet occupation of Hungary. The central and completely rhetorical question that remains is whether Swedish and Russian authorities actually aimed to solve the Wallenberg mystery. This was even a question after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Or maybe their primary goal was to remove the matter from the common political agenda completely. In other words, was the investigation guided by a foregone conclusion, and therefore in several ways, only a waste of time, energy, and good faith? Why was important information kept secret, repeatedly, not only from independent researchers, but also from Raoul Wallenberg's brother, who was an official member of the Swedish-Russian working group? For the simple reason that the information did not fit with the official story. Another basic question is therefore, to what extent did Swedish and Russian administrators intentionally protect certain sensitive information, and why? A while ago, it became known that Swedish authorities, in the 1980s, discussed and coordinated the publication of documents, in the Wallenberg case, with several countries. These countries included, funnily enough, Israel. This was such a delicate matter that if too much information regarding the reality of Raoul Wallenberg's situation and the rest of the Wallenberg family's actions during the Second World War would emerge, they would indeed find themselves in a shitstorm, of which the likes has never, ever, been seen. Stalin might also have had his reasons to keep the lid shut in this matter, because Stalin himself and the Soviet Union bought weapons from I.G. Farben through the British Minister of Armaments, Lord Beaverbrook. It wouldn't have been in the best interest for Stalin's image at home if that information were to come out. And all the while Investor, through ABB and Ericsson, were still doing business within the Soviet Union with Stalin's approval. Another thing that might make Stalin hesitant to act on the information is that throughout the Soviet era, from 1921 and through the Cold War, the Russian Central Bank Committee, the Narkomfin, was just as controlled by the banking hegemony as the current central bank in Russia is today. We can therefore with certainty now say that just as we have predicted, what is coming now is only the beginning of an information campaign that will destabilize the deep state within the Anglo-Zionist banking hegemony. Not to mention how confidence in Swedish politics will drastically change. The information that didn't come to light in the mock trials in Nuremberg will soon emerge. And that will be completely devastating for the Swedish people's self-image, because it will turn everything they thought to be true upside down. The assassination of Raoul Wallenberg took place because of something that Sweden did in its foreign policy for the benefit of the Soviet Union. It's not at all improbable that Raoul Wallenberg was executed according to Swedish wishes. Anyone who reads about the Wallenberg family's actions in connection with this process, not least regarding the Washington negotiations after the Bosch affair, can draw the same conclusion. The international political and diplomatic correspondence speaks clearly about this matter if you bother to connect the dots. What Raoul Wallenberg did together with his cousins, Jacob and Marcus Wallenberg, would be used by the Soviet Union against them in future trials, and it concerned conspiracies with the Nazis in Germany. When the Russian security service had taken him in, they looked at the Swedish diplomat with great suspicion, and branded Wallenberg as an American agent, with contacts with the German security service as well. With the negotiations on the fate of the Jews in occupied territory as a pretext, an unofficial regular communication channel between German and American intelligence was established through Wallenberg's care. This must also have included Reinhard Gehlen, the head of Nazi intelligence. Once Raoul Wallenberg had been arrested, his fate might have been decided by the Russian security service's view of his activities, if it wasn't for the game that was going on behind the scenes. Initially, it was decided that they would hand over Wallenberg to the Swedish side, but as soon as the information about his contacts with the deep state, meaning his connections to German security service and American intelligence, came from the first directorate of the MGB, the former name of the KGB, Stalin gave orders to Abakumov, the Minister of Security, to arrest him and move him to Moscow. There was never any evidence that Raoul Wallenberg was a spy, according to Ivan Serov of the KGB. But Stalin and Foreign Minister Molotov still saw the possibility of using him in their political game as the Nuremberg trials against the Nazi leaders approached after the end of the war. Because Stalin and Molotov had knowledge of what had been going on behind the scenes between the Wallenberg brothers and the Nazis. They also planned to use his testimony as a trump card in secret negotiations with the Americans on what topics should not be discussed in the Nuremberg trials. So if anything negative was said about the Soviet Union, the information about Raoul Wallenberg would be brought forward and clog the dirty mouths of the deep state globally, forever. The American side therefore instead offered to exclude questions about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact from the agenda in Nuremberg. The counterclaim was that the Russians should not raise issues of financial connection between the United States and German industrialists through mediation of the Wallenberg family, which was the real meaning of the Bosch affair. And the ownership in the IG Farben group in general were not to be discussed, as well as the secret US negotiations on a separate peace deal with the Germans. When the Nuremberg trials were over, Raoul Wallenberg, in the eyes of the Soviet leaders, seemed to have played his part. But he would still be retained for later use against Sweden, an investor. Consider this carefully. Raoul Wallenberg had now become a liability for the deep state. After the end of the Nuremberg trial, Raoul Wallenberg had lost his value. Stalin didn't think there was any point in sending him home, and it seems that it was Molotov who raised the issue of liquidation, according to an official Russian version. According to this official Russian version from 1957, the so-called Gromyko Memorandum, the Swedish diplomat died a natural death in the Lubyanka prison on July 17, 1947. In 2011, the former deputy head of the FSB's Registry and Archives Directorate, Colonel Vladimir Vinogradov, informed a Swedish diplomat in Moscow that Raoul Wallenberg had in fact been interrogated after the official death date. This is the clearest confirmation that the official Soviet version of Raoul Wallenberg's fate is a lie, but instead of bringing clarity to the case, the Swedish Foreign Ministry chose to keep the information secret. If the Wallenbergs had indeed made a deal with the Russians to liquidate Raoul, and the Russians showed him this deal, might that have made him even more talkative? The documents concerning Raoul Wallenberg, according to Stalin, were to be used for blackmail against the Swedes who had collaborated with the Nazis since long before 1938. Let's just say that the Swedish political establishment, who is now and always has been under the control of the deep state through the Wallenbergs, does not want this information to surface. All we can say is, good luck. Follow us into our next episode where we discover more about the Swedish signal intelligence and how Sweden has always been playing both sides. Thank you for listening.
Sounds a bit like Switzerland to me. But isn't this interesting though, right? I find this very, very fascinating because to me, it shows the Norse-Nazi connection, right? And how it came into being. But again, also playing both sides, right? We're always accusing the Rothschilds of playing both sides of the war, always creating the wars and funding both sides, because obviously it benefits them financially. And we understand not just financially, but loose harvesting is their thing, right? So now we see there's some other dirty players behind the scene, but let us continue.
You are listening to a podcast from the Free People's Movement out of Sweden. Episode 9. An illusionist never reveals his magic. Helmuth Teddy Turnberg, born in 1893 in Stockholm and died in 1971 in Worms, Germany. In 1913, Turnberg enrolled as a cadet at the Karlberg War College in Stockholm and graduated in 1915 with poor grades. He earned his poor grades due to bad behavior. After the War College, he ends up in Regiment I-13 in Falun, where he later becomes a captain. In 1933, he is in Germany. According to some information, during this period, Turnberg is an intimate friend of Rutger Essen, chairman of the Swedish National Association, which is also a central figure in the Swedish Nazi movement. Turnberg was then recruited by Carlos Adlercreutz in his informal build-up of a secret military security service, later called the C Bureau. Turnberg officially took a job working for Torsten Kruger, Ivo Kruger's brother, in Berlin, at the same time as he received his agent training from the German intelligence service, the Abwehr. The C Bureau was a secret intelligence organization within the Swedish defense during the Second World War. The C Bureau was active between 1939 and 1946, but was called the G Bureau, Border Bureau, until 1942 due to its work on and across Sweden's borders. However, the organization then came to be called the C Bureau after the initial letter in the manager, Carl Peterson's, first name. The C Bureau was set up in 1939, a couple of months after the outbreak of war, after a joint action by the then Swedish Commander-in-Chief, Olof Thornell, and the head of the department, Carlos Adlercreutz. Carl Peterson and his second-in-command, Helmuth Turnberg, divided the responsibility for gathering information country by country. Peterson gathered information about the Allies, while Turnberg devoted himself to Finland, Germany, Hungary, and Switzerland. Turnberg's main source of information, according to himself, was the chief of the German Abwehr, Wilhelm Canaris. In order to assist Turnberg in his efforts, he had a whole army of young women, so-called swallows, or sirens, whom he had recruited mostly through his own charm. More often than not, the girls initially didn't really understand what they were getting themselves into. The girls were paid money and were sent out into the Stockholm nightlife in order to seduce and interrogate foreign personnel stationed in Stockholm during the war. Sweden, just as always, had maintained its neutrality, and Stockholm therefore became a base of operations for other countries' intelligence operations and personnel. Stockholm was basically the spy central of the world, considering the concentration of foreign intelligence personnel in the area at that time. He was also often in Germany, where he was called Unser Schwedischer Freund, our Swedish friend, at the German intelligence service Abwehr, in Berlin. He also received a so-called Sonderausweis, a kind of domestic passport, from the Abwehr, which enabled him to travel freely by train in Germany during the war. Turnberg is said to have had particularly good contacts with Fremde Heerost, Foreign Armies East, under Reinhard Gehlen, who was responsible for gathering information from the East. In June 1940, he made sure that the Swedish newspaper, Dagens Nyheter, accredited him as an economist named George Bross in Estonia and Lithuania. As special correspondent for another Swedish newspaper, Norrköpings Tidningar, he is said to have followed the German army on the Eastern Front up to Stalingrad and continuously submitted reports to Sweden and to Reinhard Gehlen. It is said of Turnberg that on one occasion he hijacked a Soviet ferry from Tallinn with a locomotive on board and handed it over to the Germans. After returning home, Turnberg is responsible for transporting personnel from the Baltics to Gotland with the help of Kurt Andreasson, who was later responsible for the T-Office espionage against the Baltics. The C Bureau was the organization that in the autumn of 1944, on the Swedish side, was also responsible for Operation Stella Polaris, when nearly 800 people and large quantities of Finnish signal reconnaissance material from the continuation war were secretly transported from Finland to Sweden. After the war, the C Bureau's exchange of information with the German Abwehr was considered a burden on the defense. So, in 1946, Peterson was fired, and the religious historian Theed Palm, who had worked at the C Bureau since 1943, was allowed to take over the leadership. At the same time, the organization's name was changed to the T Office, again taken from the boss's first name, so the defense could officially say that the discredited C Bureau no longer existed. But Thiedpalm and Reinhard Gehlen, head of the Nazi intelligence, continued their collaboration. Remember, this was during the same time as negotiations regarding the Wallenberg family and the Bosch affair were going on in Washington. Basically, the intelligence operations still continued as before, just under the name T Office, and still with Turnberg in senior positions, although now under his cover name of George Bross. The amount of incriminating information that could be used as leverage at the disposal of the T Office was massive. It's quite amazing what they keep getting away with. Since the conclusion of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact by the Soviet Union and Germany on the 23rd of August 1939, the Soviet Union had considerable freedom of action over the Baltics and Finland, as the Western powers England and France were at war with Germany. In the autumn of 1939, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were forced to agree to allow Soviet military bases within their borders. In October 1939, the Soviet Union submitted the following demands to Finland. Finland was to lease Hanko Cape for 30 years for a naval base. The Soviet fleet would be allowed to use Lapvik, near Hanko, as an anchorage. Finland would hand over some islands in the Gulf of Finland, including the fortified Bjorko. The Finnish-Soviet border on the Karelian Peninsula was to be moved west. Fortifications on the Karelian Peninsula were to be destroyed. Finland would hand over the western part of the Fiskar Peninsula on the Arctic Ocean. Finland met some of the Soviet demands, but refused to house a naval base. Early in the morning of November 30th, Soviet artillery opened fire, followed by infantry crossing the border on the Karelian Peninsula, north of Lake Ladoga and at Petsamo. The Soviets had, prior to attacking Finland, staged a false flag attack, blaming Finland for a provocation attack on Soviet forces. This is, of course, how the official story goes. Who actually did what, and why, might become more clear. The Soviet Union was superior to Finland in terms of numbers, armaments and equipment. Stalin's optimistic planning for the war was based on a quick victory in between 10 and 12 days, as estimated by Artillery General Grigory Kulik. However, a few days before Stalin invaded Finland, the Swedes managed to break the Soviets' cryptography coding system. Throughout the Winter War, they were therefore able to provide the Finns with extremely vital information. Just a few minutes after Soviet bombing raids had started from their bases, the Finnish Air Force was notified by Sweden of the targets. Let's just say, with Sweden supplying Finland with Soviet intelligence, it made things a bit easier for them. The Swedish establishment wanted to assist the Finns, without ending up in war with the Soviets, and without irritating the Germans, who were at the time Stalin's allies, in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The negotiations were therefore difficult, as they had to be done in the greatest secrecy, so that Stalin would not find out that Germany was helping Sweden to replenish the Finnish weapons stockpiles, in the middle of a burning war. Per Albin Hansson, the Swedish Prime Minister, personally wrote a letter to Hermann Göring in these negotiations, with the help of Commander-in-Chief, Olof Thornell, where tanks, anti-aircraft guns, aircraft, machine guns, ammunition etc. were on the shopping list. Kurt Julin Danfelt, military attaché at the Swedish legation in Berlin, was also deeply involved in the negotiations, and met with Göring, out at Karen Hall, together with the Swedish purchasing manager for the Swedish Armed Forces, Birger Hedquist, and with the bank director Alan Wettermark, several times. Sweden had assisted Finland with so much of its stockpiles of ammunition, anti-aircraft guns and aircrafts, that its own stockpiles were increasingly empty. The Swedish government therefore tried to buy weapons of every conceivable kind, from all possible directions, but most of all, they hoped for business with Germany. The German arms industry was in full swing for many years, and in addition, lots of munitions had been captured during the campaign in Poland, which would quickly fit in with the Swedish army's equipment, as it was almost completely, funnily enough, produced in Sweden. The deal itself was by no means a small thing. In preserved documents, it's possible to read that the deal consisted of 292 anti-aircraft guns, 3,850 light machine guns. During the negotiations, the Swedish legation in Berlin invited Hermann Göring to a big party, where food was flown in directly from Stockholm. Among the guests were Navy attaché Anders Forshell, Prince Bertil, and also, of course, Jacob Wallenberg. The Winter War ended on March 13, 1940, when the Finnish government was forced to give way to Soviet demands. This ordeal had, however, proved quite costly for the Soviets. The official figures are quite extraordinary. By the end of the Winter War, 23,576 Finnish soldiers had died, and 43,557 wounded. The Soviet had, however, lost over 132,000 soldiers, and had almost 160,000 wounded. Like we've said before, control of information gives a massive strategic advantage. There is an official story that a Swedish mathematician, called Arne Berling, cracked the Soviets' crypto only using pen and paper. It's also claimed that he later, still using only pen and paper, even cracked the German cryptographer machine, the Geheimfenschreiber, or G machine. When asked by fellow employees to write down exactly how he cracked it, Berling simply replied, "An illusionist never reveals his magic." An illusion. Indeed. This is ludicrous, to say the least, but still maintained as the official narrative by Swedish authorities. Let's just speculate a little more. What if a third party instigated this war? Would that be possible? Well, which entity is known to orchestrate false flag attacks? Maybe it's just a coincidence that it's the same family who had control of both cryptography and telecommunications, and owned stock in the German arms industry. We're betting that a narrative that would be a better description of reality is the Wallenbergs playing both sides for their own benefit. Like always. Follow us into the next episode, where we will look to the stars in more ways than one. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Appreciate your sticker. Yeah. Again, I find it very interesting. I don't know if you guys watched the previous commentary I did, actually more on Rumble, with Joanne Breeze on the Hitler documentary as well. There we're seeing how the Allies and the Germans actually colluded, and Russia on the one side, on the other side as well. And now we're seeing the Wallenbergs very much involved as well. And, you got to ask, when they're talking about who's really behind these false flags, it's those that are hidden, not the ones that are in plain sight, like the Rothschilds. That's what I'm learning more and more. And if any of you have any comment or feedback on that, obviously, this is why we do this. I'd love to hear what you have to say, because yeah, it just seems the ones that are quietly at the background. And again, bearing in mind, they have 184 servers in their country. They have full control over pretty much the internet, right? Anyway, okay, let's move on.
Listeners, you are listening to a podcast from the Free People's Movement out of Sweden. Episode 10. The Hidden Enemy Listens to Everyone. During the 1930s and early 1940s, Rudolf Hess was the Führer's deputy. On May 10, 1941, 6 weeks before Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Hess flew to Scotland in an attempt to make peace with Britain. He was arrested and taken prisoner of war. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. This event began on June 22, 1941. Over 4.5 million soldiers from the Axis powers invaded the Soviet Union along a 2,900 kilometers long front. During World War II, both Denmark and Norway were occupied by Germany on April 9, 1940. In order for Germany to be able to communicate with its occupation troops in Norway, it was necessary to rent Swedish telephone lines. The demand was granted, with the hope of being able to use this to eavesdrop on the German messages. The crypto department was set to intercept German communications. But when they started with this, it turned out that the Germans were communicating with a code that initially seemed impossible to crack. This was the merit of the German G-machine. Mathematics professor Arne Berling, at the Swedish Armed Forces Crypt Detail, was commissioned to tackle the G-machine cipher. In a few weeks, Berling managed to crack the German G-machine, already in the summer of 1940, only using pen and paper, alone, and with only 1 or 2 days of collected messages. Through Berling's efforts, it was possible to manufacture their own crypto machines, and thus the Swedish intelligence service was able to decode almost 300,000 German messages over the next few years. The G-machines were manufactured by Siemens, in Germany, and it's a pretty safe bet that these machines were already compromised, right from the start. Berling's role as the illusionist cryptographer was only just that. An illusion. In 1941, Swedish authorities became the first outside Germany to know that an attack on the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was imminent. This information was relayed to Stalin from the Soviet ambassador in Stockholm, Alexandra Kollontaj. In June 1942, the Germans found out that Sweden could read their messages sent with the G-machine. Shortly afterwards, the German signals became completely incomprehensible as the Germans had switched to other cryptographer machines. At that point, Stalin had realized that Sweden had been able to listen to the German communications, at least as early as 1940. And after the Winter War with Finland, he probably figured out that they were listening to Soviet communications, as well. In 1942, Stalin knew. The Cold War was already approaching. The Continuation War, also known as the Second Soviet-Finnish War, was a conflict fought by Finland together with Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. This conflict was part of World War II and lasted from 1941 to 1944. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany launched an invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 days later, the Soviet Union conducted an air raid on Finnish cities. This prompted Finland to declare war and allowed German troops stationed in Finland to begin offensive warfare. In connection with the end of the Continuation War, there was an operation called Stella Polaris. This was a secret Finnish intelligence operation with the aim of moving equipment and sensitive intelligence material from Finland to Sweden. That way, operations could continue in Sweden, and the material would not fall into Soviet hands, which was of great importance to Sweden. Remember from our last episode how Sweden supplied Finland with Soviet intelligence during the Winter War. Immediately before World War II, the Nordic countries stated their neutrality, but Sweden changed its position to that of non-belligerent at the start of the Winter War. Operation Stella Polaris was planned for the summer of 1944, when it seemed clear that Finland would lose the war, and it was estimated that the Soviet Union would be able to occupy Finland. The operation was based in the small fishing village of Nampnäs, in Narpes, Ostrobothnia, from where the archive was shipped to Swedish ports. One of the intentions from the Finnish side was to be able to establish Finnish military signal reconnaissance on Swedish soil for a possible Finnish government in exile. The intentions from the Swedish side, if they aren't obvious enough, was to not get caught violating the rules of war, supplying Finland with Soviet intelligence and weapons during armed conflict. On September 22, 1944, a very large part of the Finnish signal reconnaissance was transferred to Sweden. Operation Stella Polaris became important for the construction of the Swedish Armed Forces Radio Agency, the FRA. From the Swedish side, Major Carl Peterson, head of the Sea Bureau, was responsible for the operation. Approximately 800 people were transported through Finland, on 3 ships across the Gulf of Bothnia, between Narpes and Härnösand, and 1 ship between Nystad and Gävle. The ships were also loaded with packing boxes with archives and signal reconnaissance equipment. As the Soviet Union did not annex Finland, after the Moscow Peace Treaty on September 19, 1944, the majority of Finnish staff with families returned home around the turn of the year 1944 to 1945, except those employed by the Swedish Armed Forces Radio Agency. They had to cross the border at Torn River on their own, in secret. Sweden was offered to take over equipment and certain documents. The Swedish Armed Forces Radio Agency thus gained access to technical equipment and 7 filing cabinets, which became an important basis for their newly started operations. Operation Stella Polaris gave Sweden access to large amounts of sensitive materials, as well as knowledge from signaling technicians. For Finland, the affair entailed domestic political complications because of the Communist Party's strong influence in the government. From October 1944, the intelligence material was sorted in the basement of Hotel Aston, in Stockholm. Operations manager Raoul Wallenberg had then microfilmed the material and sold it to intelligence agencies in several countries. It was then shipped from Hotel Aston by the Swedish Armed Forces Radio Agency. Large parts of the material got stored by Carl Bond at Horningsholm Castle, and 29 boxes by Svante Paulsson at Rottneros from the 20th of March 1945. 7 boxes with sensitive material had previously been handed over to the radio agency. The Finns involved in Operation Stella Polaris were persecuted and arrested after the return of the communist-dominated Finnish state police, the security police, the so-called Red Stapo. It was not until the early 1950s that the Chancellor of Finland declared that those who took part in Operation Stella Polaris were not in a position to be charged with war crimes. In Nampnäs, there is a memorial to the operation. 15 to 20 Finnish signal scouts, who came to Sweden in Operation Stella Polaris, immediately became Swedish citizens and remained as employees of the radio agency in Sweden. The Finnish intelligence chief Alla de Parsinen, who along with Raoul Wallenberg had the highest responsibility for the operation, lived in the United States until the 1970s. Raoul Wallenberg moved to Spain, where he assumed the name Ricardo Palma and started a construction company with his son. Later, in December 1960, the original material that was left in Sweden was burned at Lofsta garbage station in Stockholm. Whatever the radio agency still had was also burned. This was staged after an irregular intervention by the retired Swedish general and former head of the army, Carl August Ehrensvärd. At the time of Operation Stella Polaris, he was the chief of Swedish defense. Let's just say that the Swedes wanted to make sure that the information stayed secret. Operation Stella Polaris has been documented in books, radio documentaries, and TV movies since the 1990s, but many questions remain. One such question is whether the Soviets would look kindly upon the evidence inside the archives of Stella Polaris as it pertained to Sweden's role in the Winter War. Sweden was, after all, a neutral or non-belligerent country. On paper, the fact that Finland has been under the thumb of the Swedish deep state since pretty much forever can't stay hidden much longer. At the same time, the insights that the deep state was behind the creation of communism have increased dramatically. Let's just say that the Finnish people are in for some surprising revelations in the not-too-distant future. I wonder what happened to the microfilms. Whoever Wallenberg had sold it to, maybe they still have it. And who's to say that Wallenberg didn't keep his own copies? It would be a terrible shame if this information were to surface. Especially now, when things are going so terribly well for the deep state and the Wallenberg family. Follow us into the next episode, where we take a look at a certain general who is more important than most people realize. Thank you for listening. Listeners, you are listening to a podcast from the Free People's Movement out of Sweden. Episode 11. General George S. Patton. The murder of an American hero. General George S. Patton was one of the most prominent generals on the side of the Allies during World War II. He is now so legendary that it is difficult to know where Patton ends and where the myth begins. We will shed light on Patton's fate from a slightly different perspective, while at the same time wondering, what might Donald Trump think about this issue? George S. Patton was born on November 11, 1885, and died on December 21, 1945, in Heidelberg, in Allied-occupied Germany. He died shortly after a car crash had left him paralyzed. But we will come back to Patton's death a little bit later. During World War II, Patton led the American armored forces in North Africa, landed in Italy, and was one of the leaders in the liberation of Europe. The Germans had signed their unconditional surrender to the Allied forces in May of 1945, a victory largely won off the backs of Patton's unstoppable Third Army that stampeded its way across northern France after the successful D-Day invasion. Under Patton's decisive leadership, the Third Army drove retreating German forces out of occupied territories in an unprecedented display of military brilliance, enabling, among other feats, the liberation of Paris, said Patton biographer Robert Wilcox. But toward the end of the war, General Eisenhower and other commanding officers had come to consider General Patton a liability for his unorthodox approach to warfare. Patton had repeatedly defied authority, challenged orders, and loudly disagreed with the United States post-war foreign policy. General Patton was an outspoken critic of the Soviets, going against the U.S. foreign policy position that saw the Soviets as an ally and crucial to maintaining peace in Europe. Patton told his peers, "We've kicked the hell out of one bastard, only to help establish a second one, more evil and more dedicated than the first." Patton hated kowtowing to the Kremlin. Furthermore, he protested against the secret decision that Washington made, not to press the Russians for the safe return of thousands of captured Allied POWs that were still under Soviet control in 1945. As a result, these abandoned POWs were either shot or spent the rest of their lives working in Gun. Simply couldn't understand why the West had conceded Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union, and had voiced his concern about this openly. Among others, biographer Douglas Wilcox wrote in his book called Target, Patton, that he believes that the plot to stop Patton could have easily evolved into an assassination order. Citing Eisenhower's political ambitions, Wilcox wrote, "The writing was on the wall." Now that victory in Europe was clearly in sight, Patton was no longer needed. His flamboyant style and unpredictability was becoming a liability that Eisenhower could not afford anymore. Well, even if that was the case, there could very well be even more obvious reasons for wanting to get Patton out of the way. Obvious, if you know the real history. What is less well known, for reasons that are easy to understand today, is the fact that Patton visited Sweden twice. The first time was as a participant in the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm. Patton traveled at his own expense and participated in pentathlon, where among other things, fencing, shooting, and off-road riding were included. A mistake occurred in the shooting. Patton thought that a military weapon should be used, and chose a heavy-caliber .38 revolver, while most competitors used a .22 caliber. The problem was that Patton's heavier ammunition tore apart the center of the target, so that the referees could not ensure that all the shots had hit. Patton was awarded a miss, despite the opinion of other competitors that all shots had hit the mark. The result was that Patton ended up in 27th place in the shooting and 4th place overall. Without this mistake, Patton would have become a gold medalist. Patton was a horseman and competed as a jumper and polo player. He is best known in the horse context for his efforts to save the Lipizzaner stallions from the Spanish riding school in Vienna. 1,200 German war booty horses, of which 300 Lipizzaners, were also rescued from an uncertain fate. In this way, many breeding lines could be saved. After the end of the war in 1945, Patton came into conflict with the political arm of the deep state in the United States. His statements had been controversial, and Patton was virtually deprived of his command, but was hailed everywhere as a great hero and liberator. In the autumn of 1945, Patton visited acquaintances and official figures in France, England, Denmark and Sweden, which can probably today be seen as somewhat naive. After the end of the war, the Swedish government wanted to invite General Eisenhower to Sweden. Eisenhower was, although, as luck would have it, busy with other duties, and he suggested in a practical way that General Patton would instead represent him during the visit to Sweden. Let's just say that Eisenhower knew about the Bosch affair. At the end of November 1945, Patton visited Sweden. The then Army Chief General Archibald Douglas gave dinner at Taka Udden in Stockholm, and Patton was in great shape as the socialite he really was. However, he was not able to completely hide his deep suspicion of the Soviet Union, unfortunately. For example, the story behind the Russian Revolution, and the fact that Stalin had an own villa in Stockholm during the war, called Villa Kassman, was apparently not so well known to the general. Patton had walked right into the wolf's den and hadn't realized it, at least not before it was too late. He is said to have visited the Swedish king, Gustav V, completely informally, and little did he know about the intrigues between the Swedish king and a man called Kurt Heiby, Torsten Noting, and Saro. Let's just say that the connection between the Swedish establishment and the Nazis would have been more apparent to him then. But that's another story. Patton also met the Swedish pentathlon team from 1912, and a proper party had been arranged, probably at Stormästergarden. During the party, pistols were produced, and a reshooting of the Olympic bout from 1912 was made. Patton had the opportunity to now significantly improve his result, and happily got to take the new target home, as a memory of the evening. On the morning of November 30, 1945, an expectant crowd in the Hagedal terrain stood waiting for the American armored general, George Patton. The program included a one-day visit to Uppsala at Upplands Regiment. A realistic warlike exercise was to be held in Patton's honor. The preparations had taken several hours, and now both the commander and the troops were waiting for the well-known armored general's arrival in Hagedalen. He arrived at the appointed time, accompanied by, among others, Prince Gustav Adolf and several senior military and civilian dignitaries. The exercises went well, and the guest showed a lively interest in what was going on, as he followed in the front lines and often consulted with both officers and privates. Finally, he gave an overview of the course of events for the assembled battalion in Patton's Hage, a name later given to the location, derived from this occasion. The journey was then directed to the castle, where Governor Hildering Kjellman was Cicero. The intention was to then continue to the cathedral, but when General Patton came down from the hall to the courtyard, he suddenly said, "I do not want to go to that church, because it reminds me that I am going to die." The program must therefore be changed, and the thousands of Uppsala residents who waited in the drizzle in the surroundings of the cathedral had to turn home. After lunch at the officers' fair at Polakbacken, to which several Uppsala residents and some who participated in modern pentathlon during the Olympic Games in Stockholm were invited. At coffee time, some of them sat with him. The general then gave an exhaustive and vivid description of his war experiences. He eventually got on with his task of conquering Prague at the end of the war and being ordered to stop at the border with Czechoslovakia, because the Russians would get the credit for the conquest of Prague. Patton then spoke about his efforts to have the order revoked and about his failure in this regard. "Finally, I sat down and cried over my superior short-sightedness," the general closed his story. He then assessed what the world had to expect as a result of all the misguided consideration of Stalin. Patton's views on the matter were quite harsh, which some years later would prove absolutely correct, above all concerning Germany's shared status, in an eerie way. Colonel All-Norman would 20 years later be quoted in the book My Uppsala, saying, "For my part, I have never before or since heard anyone who has been so prophesied in major political matters as this American general." Patton basically predicted the Cold War. Take a wild guess whether that would have been a popular thing to say within the best-kept secret of the deep state, Sweden. The military attaché that was Patton's escort during his visit to Sweden was called Thord Bond. Thord Bond was the son of Carl Bond, which during this time was storing the documents from Operation Stella Polaris at his castle, Horningsholm. To make things even more special, it was in fact that same Carl Bond that had won the gold medal, instead of Patton, at the Olympics in 1912. Like we've said before, you can't even make this up. Carl Bond and Patton met at that same Horningsholm castle for dinner, and that would be the last night in Sweden for Patton's part. The deep state had been by Patton's side every step of the way. Patton's visit to Sweden was no coincidence. The whole point had been to feel him out and decide what they should do about him. What could possibly go wrong for Patton after that? About a week later, back in Germany, Patton's chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, suggested a hunting trip. They left the next day in Patton's Cadillac. Driving them was 19-year-old Private First Class Horace Woodring, and they were accompanied by Sergeant Joe Screws, who was leading them in an open-air jeep that carried rifles, supplies, and a hunting dog. The drive began without incident. The weather was cold but visibility was clear and the road was virtually uninhabited of any and all traffic. Sitting in the back seat, Patton was surveying the war-torn landscape, littered by derelict vehicles, and remarked, "How awful war is. Think of the waste." Woodring stopped at a railroad track to allow for the passing train and noticed off in the distance a standard-issue GMC armor truck that was pulled over on the shoulder of the road. Just as Woodring started back up, the 2.5-ton truck, with a canvas-covered flatbed, pulled away from the curb and began slowly advancing in their direction. Woodring later said that he didn't think anything of it at the time. Suddenly, the driver inexplicably took a vicious, hard left turn in front of Patton's Cadillac. "I had no opportunity to avoid him whatsoever," said Horace Woodring in a 1986 interview, and the two vehicles crashed in relative slow motion, going 20 miles per hour. General Patton had ricocheted onto General Gay's lap, where he laid momentarily unconscious and bleeding from a massive head injury that extended from the bridge of his nose up toward the middle of his scalp. Patton told Gay, "I'm having trouble breathing, Hap. Work my fingers for me." As Gay moved Patton's fingers, it became clear that he had no feeling in them. He continued his plea, "Go ahead, Hap. Work my fingers." Patton was paralyzed. Despite the proximity of a hospital in Mannheim, he was taken to a facility over 20 miles away, in Heidelberg. At first, Patton's prognosis was not good. He remained in critical condition for the first few days when he began to make remarkable strides toward recovery. His presiding physician, Dr. Sterling, wrote on his medical chart, "The muscles of respiration began to function feebly." This gave us high hopes that the spinal cord was not as seriously damaged as we had every reason to believe in the beginning. In addition to these favorable neurological signs, his general condition remained remarkably good. The truck driver responsible for the fatal crash was a soldier from Camden, New Jersey, named Robert Thompson. He had stolen the army vehicle, or perhaps taken it out for a joyride with two other passengers that were never named or seen again, but are pictured in the background of the only image that exists from the accident scene. Nobody has ever been able to explain why or what Thompson was doing 50 miles away from his base. He had no order to be there and he was in violation of his rules. General Patton continued to improve, and on December 18th, he told his wife, "I am feeling really well." For the first time. Just as they began to make arrangements to send Patton home, he took a turn for the worse. 30 minutes after his wife left the hospital to procure lunch, on December 21, 1945, General Patton suffered a massive pulmonary embolism. General Patton was dead. Wilcox, the Patton biographer, had contacted Horace Woodring's son, John, who also finds the entire collision suspicious. He said, "As soon as the truck driver got to him, he veered right into the car, 3 drunk truck occupants who pretty much disappeared with all the general's flags and what not. They accidentally turn into that? I don't think so. Not even if they were drunk." When asked if his father may have thought the collision was an assassination attempt, Woodring's son said, "Well, you know, he always had his thoughts possibly that it could have been." Military police and a number of unidentified investigators had descended on the collision scene with unprecedented speed. This alone is curious, seeing as how the accident took place on a deserted road in a remote area. The collision was said to have occurred around 11:45 a.m. Patton was in an ambulance by 12:20, which begs the questions: how were responding officers able to arrive so quickly? Had they known of a plot to assassinate Patton ahead of time? Were they just standing by waiting for it to happen? Inexplicably, Robert Thompson, the truck driver, was quickly whisked away by the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CID. Wilcox learned of this revelation from Thompson's lawyer, who said, the CID got him out of Germany that night. They flew him to England. He was incommunicado for a couple of days. If this is true, the move was unusual. Why would Thompson need to be taken to an undisclosed location in England when there were American forts nearby in Frankfurt and Nuremberg? What was he doing there? Like most details in this case, there is no record of Thompson's 4-day trip to the UK. In fact, there is not even a mention of General Patton in Thompson's military file at all. Many of these outstanding questions might easily be answered if reports from the scene and subsequent investigations hadn't mysteriously vanished. The fact that an official accident report and all other records pertaining to the death of one of America's most decorated war heroes is missing seems more than suspicious. It's unfathomable. Especially when considering the exacting measures to which the military approaches documentation. In 1979, a former member of World War II's elite Black Ops team, known as Jedburghs, made the astonishing allegation that he was hired as a hitman to kill Patton. Douglas Bazata claimed that it was an order given to him by General Wild Bill Donovan, the chief of the Office of Strategic Services, an intelligence organization that was the precursor to the CIA. The OSS. Remember who was the chief of the OSS in Switzerland at the time? Alan Dulles. Wonder if he knew General Donovan. While serving as a Jedburgh, Bazata was an expert marksman and hired assassin who completed many covert operations that involved him dangerously parachuting into enemy lines to help organize the resistance in France. On the CIA's webpage dedicated to the Jedburghs, it lists their motto as surprise, kill, and vanish, which eerily rings true in Bazata's mission to stop Patton. Bazata said that the car accident was just a ruse for him to shoot the general with a silent projectile that he said would cause the equivalent of a whiplash suffered at a speed of 80 or 100 miles an hour. He explained that he hid behind derelict equipment, cast away on the side of the road, waiting for Patton's car to drive by. Furthermore, he said that this special-made weapon was fashioned in a foreign country, whose identity he never knew. Instead of bullets, the device launched rocks that could easily look like debris in the aftermath and create damage that didn't look like bullet wounds. Perhaps this explains why Patton's injuries were so severe in comparison to the other passengers who walked away from the accident with just a few scrapes. Experts were always confounded by how the general broke his neck in whiplash going 20 miles per hour. Well, seeing as Wild Bill Donovan was already dead, long before 1979, and this drew attention away from the now obvious suspects. This revelation might indeed have stopped people from looking further into this matter. They give you enough for closure, but never seem to get caught, and nobody behind the scenes ever goes to jail. Seem familiar? Towards the end of his career, Bazata worked as an aide to the Navy Secretary during the Reagan administration, was a member of the 9/11 Commission and worked on Senator McCain's 2008 presidential campaign. Bazata might indeed have shot Patton, but now he was acting as a decoy, and pointed to Donovan's orders to draw people off the scent, and he got a wonderful career as thanks. In 2014, the host of the CBS This Morning, Bill O'Reilly, said, "We call for a reopening of the investigation by the Justice Department today. I want to know who killed this hero, and I certainly do not believe it was an accident." Patton, 1 minute was joking with the nurses and drinking cognac in his bed, and then all of a sudden the next day, boom, he was dead. General Patton was a threat to the deep state and the hidden enemy's plans, and got killed for it. It was then covered up, like always. It's time the truth came to light. Why is Patton so important? Well, you do the math. When did he die? Go look at some pictures of General Patton. Who does he look like? Maybe there are lots of people with an axe to grind with the deep state. Maybe some of those people actually decided to do something about it. And maybe these players don't just plan 1 or 2 steps ahead. The best is yet to come. Thank you for listening.
Well, there we have it. This has been going on for longer than we can imagine, right? This taking people out suspiciously. You know, it is also, when we look at Nelson Mandela, the whole Nelson Mandela story, and I'm a firm believer that the real Nelson Mandela died in prison in 1986, 1985. I remember at the time there were rumblings and there were big rumors that he died, but then the media retracted it, saying, no, that didn't happen. And, you know, I'm a firm believer as well that the reason they took him out in prison, because I don't believe he died naturally, was because he wouldn't actually conform. I don't for 1 minute believe that the real Nelson Mandela would have conformed to this, from this militant warrior fighting for his people, to this saint narrative after how many years? 27 years, right? And elections were held in South Africa on the 27th of April that year. And I don't believe that he was willing to comply with the narrative they set out for him, which is why he had the doppelganger, clone, whatever. I still am confused about whether it's a double, whether it's designer babies kind of thing, or whether it's clones. I don't know, to be perfectly honest, but I do know that the person that came out of prison was not Nelson Mandela. And when we look at what they were doing, yeah, as well, you know, with General Patton, how many times do we see this, that there's these accidents? Or, I mean, for me, there was no doubt that they put something in his drink. If he was having a cognac and then suddenly, boom, everything goes ass about face, and there he is, you know, and obviously being a thorn in the side of the deep flesh, the deep state, right? So yeah, very interesting. I'd love to hear your comments on this. And next week we have our final installation of this docu-series. We'll be looking at Lord of the Rings as well. Very interesting how that correlates to Sweden and Stockholm in particular. Okay, all you beautiful people, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon or morning, wherever it is for you. And I know my beverage is now kaput, alles klar. I've got to go and get another one. I will see you back at 7:30, which is 2.5 hours from now. It's just after 5 now, with Melissa Duge Spears, author of Holy Disobedience, Blowing the Whistle on the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So let's hear what she has to say. She has been on for a previous interview where she spoke a lot about the church in particular and how it operates really. And tonight we're going to be speaking about her particular experience. Very interesting. So yeah, thank you, Morna. I see you have posted that there now. So if you haven't caught the previous episode and just get some information on this incredible lady, there it is. And in the meantime, take good care of your beautiful selves, and I shall see you back in a couple of hours. Mwah.